Picture this. You step into a room and the temperature doesn't change because of what you're wearing, what you drive, or who you know. It changes because you're the only man in there who isn't auditioning. You're not scanning faces, not performing confidence, not trying to be the funniest, not trying to be the loudest, not trying to win the room. You're simply present, shoulders settled, breathing slow, eyes clear. You take your time like time isn't chasing you. And that's why heads turn. Not because you demanded attention, because you didn't. Most men don't realize how rare that is. Most men live in performance mode. They talk a little too much, laugh a little too loud, explain a little too fast, text a little too often. They're always doing something to be chosen. They're always trying to get picked, approved, affirmed. They're always trying to prove they belong. And if you look closely, you'll see the cost of that. A man who performs for. Attention is a man whose mood is controlled by the room. If the room approves, he's alive. If the room ignores him, he collapses. If she smiles, he rises. If she pulls back, he panics. His confidence isn't confidence. It's alone. And the room can call it back any time. But the man who doesn't perform sends a different signal. He doesn't need the room to be okay. He's okay before he arrives. That's the root of the calm you're talking about. Not the fake, cool guy, act. Not the cold, distant, avoidant routine, real calm. The kind that comes from inner stability. The kind that feels like strength without aggression. Here's what most men get wrong. They think attraction is about showing more. More jokes, more effort, more compliments, more messages, more emotional proof, more pressure, more plans, more validation. And what they don't see is that more often reads as need. Need is loud, even when your voice is quiet. Need is the hidden tremble under the words, please like me. And women have seen it 1,000 times. They've seen the rehearsed lines, the strategic compliments, the overfamiliar intimacy too early, the deep talks that are really disguised attempts to lock in closeness. They've seen the guy who tries to buy connection with attention. They've seen the guy who tries to force comfort and calls it romance. They've seen men who can't sit in silence because silence makes them face themselves. So when a man shows up who can hold stillness without turning it into a drama, it lands differently. Not because he's playing a game, because he's not. Because he doesn't need to win the moment. Because he's not bargaining for approval. Because he can be there without needing her to manage his emotional state. That is attractive for a reason that has nothing to do with techniques and everything to do with human nervous systems. People feel safe around stable men, not perfect men. Stable men. Men whose emotions exist but don't drive the steering wheel. Men who don't turn every small moment into a test. Men who don't punish with silence, explode with anger, or collapse into insecurity. Men who can handle tension without turning it into chaos. That's what your calm signals when it's real. Capacity. Capacity to handle stress. Capacity to lead yourself. Capacity to make decisions without needing applause. Capacity to be consistent. Capacity to protect peace instead of feeding drama. And peace is rare. Peace is rare in a culture that rewards reaction, oversharing, and constant performance. Peace is rare in a world where everyone is broadcasting a version of themselves and begging for it to be validated. So yes, when you're the man who isn't trying to be seen, you will be seen. And here's the part most men don't understand until it hits them. When you stop chasing attention, you become interesting. When you stop begging to be understood, people want to understand you. When you stop explaining yourself, your words carry more weight. Because you're not trying to sell yourself. You're simply standing there, solid. That doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you uncommon. But let's get specific, because vague motivation doesn't change a man's life. Discipline does. Clarity does. The calm, grounded man isn't created by repeating a mantra. He's built by removing behaviors that leak energy and replacing them with habits that generate it. So let's talk about what calm actually is. Calm is not numbness. Calm is not acting indifferent. Calm is not ignoring texts and calling it mysterious. Calm is not withholding affection to create anxiety. That's not calm. That's insecurity wearing a mask. Real calm is emotional regulation. It's self-respect. It's restraint. It's the ability to feel something fully without letting it hijack your behavior. It's the ability to pause. And that pause is everything. Because most men don't have a pause. They have impulse. They get a feeling and immediately act it out. They feel nervous and they talk too much. They feel uncertain and they over-explain. They feel desire and they chase. They feel threatened and they puff up. They feel ignored and they double text. They feel anxious and they demand reassurance. No pause, just reaction. And reaction is predictable. Predictable is boring. Predictable is safe in a weak way, not safe in a strong way. Predictable is the man who can be controlled with approval and punishment. Give him attention, he stays. Remove attention, he breaks. Predictable is a man whose center lives outside his chest. Calm is the opposite. Calm is centered. Centered is the man who doesn't speed up his words to keep a conversation alive. Centered is the man who can let a moment breathe. Centered is the man who can hear something that stings and still choose a measured response. Centered is the man who doesn't treat every female mood as an emergency he needs to fix. And that's why calm reads as power. Because power, at its core, is self-control. Not control over other people. Control over yourself. If you want to understand why women respond to this, don't make it mystical. Make it practical. A woman has to ask one question, consciously or unconsciously, when she considers a man. Is this man safe to attach my life to? Safe doesn't mean soft. Safe doesn't mean passive. Safe doesn't mean always agreeable. Safe means emotionally steady. Safe means he won't crumble under pressure. Safe means his words mean something. Safe means he's not pretending. Safe means his mood doesn't swing wildly based on external validation. Safe means he doesn't need her to be his therapist, his mother, his audience, and his proof of worth. If you've ever watched a woman lose attraction for a guy who did everything right, this is usually why. He didn't do it from strength. He did it from need. He gave, not from fullness, but from hunger. He tried too hard, not because he cared, but because he needed the outcome. And a woman can feel that. It doesn't matter how good your lines are if your energy is begging. Now, does this mean you should be distant and detached? No. A man with standards is not the same as a man with walls. A man who is calm is not the same as a man who is unavailable. The grounded man isn't withholding warmth. He's selective with his investment. He doesn't hand out intimacy like a discount coupon. He doesn't overshare his entire history because he's trying to create instant closeness. He doesn't confess every wound early because he wants her to feel responsible for his emotions. He has depth, but he doesn't dump it on strangers. He has feelings, but he doesn't throw them like weapons. He has desire, but he doesn't let it turn him into a servant. That's the difference between a man and a boy. A man can want something without becoming owned by it. So when you talk about the quiet man being complete, you're pointing at something real. He's no longer outsourcing his identity to a woman's reaction. That is a major shift. Most men are living in a constant negotiation with female approval. They don't know it, but they're asking all the time, am I enough now? They ask it with their texts. They ask it with their jokes. They ask it with their gym progress. They ask it with their stories. They ask it with their money. They ask it with their social media. They ask it with their constant need to be perceived a certain way. And the tragedy is this: the more you ask that question, the less you feel like the answer is yes, because you've trained your brain to believe your worth is up for vote. The calm man has stepped out of that, not because he hates women, not because he's trying to be a Sigma, not because he's playing a cold strategy, because he finally decided that his life is his responsibility. He finally decided he's not going to build his identity out of other people's reactions. He finally decided to become the source. That's why his presence feels heavier. That's why he doesn't need to fill silence. That's why he can listen without interrupting. That's why his eye contact doesn't feel needy. That's why his compliments don't feel like bribes. That's why his attention feels valuable, because he's not throwing it away. Now let's address something that needs to be said clearly. If you try to imitate calm as a tactic, it will backfire, because fake calm has a smell. Fake calm is stiff posture and forced pauses. Fake calm is delayed texting to trigger anxiety. Fake calm is ignoring someone to create leverage. Fake calm is playing uninterested while secretly obsessing. That's not calm. That's control games. And games attract chaos. You might hook someone's attention temporarily, but you will never build respect, trust, or real desire on manipulation. All you'll build is insecurity, and insecure connection is always expensive. It costs you peace. It costs you time. It costs you dignity. So we're not building mystery, we're building stability. And the irony is that stability creates mystery naturally. Because when you're stable, you don't reveal yourself to be liked. You reveal yourself in layers over time. Because that's how real trust works. And when you stop explaining yourself, people wonder who you are because they're used to men who advertise. You don't have to perform mysterious. You simply have to stop being predictable in the worst way. Stop being the guy who does everything for approval. Now, I'm going to make this practical. If you want to become this man, your training isn't a pickup line. It's your nervous system. You need to practice being unreactive without being unkind. You need to practice being warm without being needy. You need to practice being confident without being loud. You need to practice having boundaries without having an attitude. You need to practice silence without punishing anyone with it. That's skill. That's maturity. Start with the simplest discipline that changes everything: the 2-second rule. Before you answer, pause. Not a dramatic pause, a natural pause. 2 seconds. When she asks a question, you breathe in. You let the question land. You answer from your center, not your impulse. This does 3 things. It makes you sound thoughtful instead of eager. It slows your nervous system. It makes your words carry weight. Most men answer immediately because they're afraid of silence. They're afraid that if they don't respond fast, they'll lose the moment. They're afraid they'll look awkward. But the man who can sit in silence owns the moment. Silence is not empty when you're grounded. Silence is space. Space is confidence. Now add the second practice. Reduce explanation. The average man over-explains because he's trying to defend his value. He justifies his decisions. He rationalizes his preferences. He writes paragraphs to prove he's not a bad guy. He gives a long speech about why he didn't reply fast. He turns simple boundaries into debates. Stop doing that. Not because you're trying to be harsh, because you respect yourself. A boundary is a sentence, not a dissertation. I can't tonight. I've got plans. That's it. No guilt. No apology parade. No long story to convince her you're still worthy. If she respects you, she will respect clarity. If she doesn't respect you, a longer explanation won't fix it. It will just teach her that your boundaries come with negotiations. Third practice, speak less but say more. A lot of men talk themselves out of attraction. They start with potential, then flood the space with words until the energy dies. They think constant talking equals connection. It doesn't. It often equals anxiety. The goal isn't to be quiet like a statue. The goal is to be intentional. When you speak, make it clean. Use fewer filler words. Cut out the nervous laughter. Don't narrate your insecurities. Don't rush to prove you're interesting. Ask better questions instead. Most men ask surface questions because they're afraid of depth, or they jump into depth too fast because they're trying to create instant intimacy. Both are mistakes. The grounded man can guide a conversation like a leader, not a performer. He asks questions that invite her to reveal herself. What do you enjoy that most people don't get? What's something you're proud of that you never talk about? What's a lesson you learned the hard way? Then he listens. And here is the key. He doesn't interrupt to impress. He doesn't turn her story into a story about him. He doesn't try to fix her emotions. He lets her be human without making it his job to rescue her. That one behavior alone separates men from boys. Because a boy hears emotion and panics. A man hears emotion and stays steady. Women remember that, not because it's magical, because it's rare. Fourth practice, control your body language. Your body will confess what your mouth tries to hide. If your hands fidget, if your foot taps, if your shoulders cave, if your eyes dart, you're communicating insecurity, even if your words are confident. So train stillness, not stiffness, stillness. Plant your feet, relax your jaw, drop your shoulders, slow your movements. When you reach for your drink, do it calmly, not like you're racing. When you walk, walk with rhythm, not urgency. When you sit, occupy the chair like you belong there. Most men shrink themselves without realizing it. They apologize for space. They hunch. They fold. They try to look non-threatening because they're afraid of being judged. A grounded man isn't aggressive, but he isn't small. He's simply there. And that there-ness becomes a form of authority. Fifth practice, stop chasing, start choosing. Chasing is when your actions are driven by fear of losing her. Choosing is when your actions are driven by alignment with your values. Chasing sounds like this. I hope she replies. I need to keep her interested. I have to say the right thing. I can't mess this up. Choosing sounds like this. I like her, and I'll show interest without losing myself. I'll invest if it's mutual. I'll communicate clearly and let the outcome be what it is. I'm building a life either way. That last sentence is where calm comes from. You're building a life either way. You're not using women as your proof of worth. You're not treating a date like a final exam. You're not treating rejection like a sentence. You're treating your life like a mission you're responsible for. And that changes everything. Now, let's talk about the part men avoid. Emotional strength. Because you can't be calm if you're fragile. If you're sleep deprived, anxious, addicted to cheap stimulation, and carrying unresolved anger, you will not hold composure consistently. You'll imitate it for a week, then crack. Calm isn't a costume, it's conditioning. So build the foundation. Sleep like a man who respects his mind. Eat like a man who wants stable energy. Train like a man who needs strength, not attention. Work like a man who wants autonomy, not applause. Spend time alone like a man who enjoys his own company. A man who can't be alone will always cling to a woman. He will call it love, but it will be need. And need destroys calm. So here's the deeper truth. You're not becoming calm to get women. You're becoming calm because a man without calm is easy to control. He's controlled by lust, controlled by ego, controlled by social approval, controlled by fear, controlled by distraction, controlled by other people's moods. That's not freedom. And women can sense when a man isn't free. They might enjoy the attention, but they won't respect the weakness behind it. The calm man is free, not free from feeling, free from being owned by his feelings. That's why he can be warm without being desperate. He can care without collapsing. He can love without losing his spine. Now let's address the modern confusion. People have started calling avoidance stoicism. A man goes cold, disappears, refuses to communicate, and tells himself he's unbothered. He's not unbothered. He's afraid. He's afraid of needing. He's afraid of being rejected. He's afraid of being seen. So he retreats and calls it strength. That's not strength. That's hiding. Real stoic energy isn't running away from emotion. It's staying present with it while keeping your behavior disciplined. If something bothers you, you don't explode, but you also don't pretend it doesn't exist. You address it calmly, directly, and you move accordingly. That's mature masculinity, not coldness, clarity. So if you're going to build this, build it with integrity. Do not use silence as punishment. Do not use delayed replies to create anxiety. Do not use mystery as a trick. Those are weak games that attract unstable outcomes. Instead, do this. Be consistent. Be direct. Be measured. Be honest. And be willing to walk away from what disrespects you. That last part is the real source of calm. The man who cannot walk away will always negotiate his dignity. He will tolerate disrespect for attention. He will accept mixed signals for the hope of being chosen. He will betray his standards to avoid being alone. And that man will never be calm because his peace depends on someone else's behavior. The calm man has a line, and he doesn't have to announce it with threats. He just has it. He doesn't argue to be respected. He lives in a way that demands it. Now let's talk about what happens when you become this man. First, conversations change. When you talk less and listen more, people start revealing themselves. Not because you forced them, but because your stillness creates space. Most people are starving for space. They're constantly interrupted, constantly rushed, constantly corrected. When you offer space, you become memorable. Second, women start leaning in. Not because you ignored them, because you didn't chase them. There's a difference. Ignoring is disrespect. Not chasing is self-respect, and self-respect is attractive. Third, your standards become visible. When you don't overinvest, when you don't overexplain, when you don't scramble for validation, you signal that your attention is earned, not freely handed out. That makes your interest feel valuable, not because you're scarce by strategy, but because you're focused by nature. Fourth, you stop needing outcomes. And that's where real power lives. When you stop needing outcomes, you stop being manipulated by them. A woman can't control you with approval if you don't worship approval. A woman can't control you with silence if silence doesn't scare you. A woman can't control you with unpredictability if you have your own direction. That's the psychological shift that makes you feel solid. Now, I'm going to give you a framework to build this in the real world, not theory, practice. The 6-week presence protocol. Week 1, silence training. Every day, have one conversation where you deliberately speak 20% less than you normally would. Ask more questions. Pause before answering. Let the other person fill space. Notice how uncomfortable it feels. That discomfort is your addiction to approval being challenged. Week 2, boundary training. Make one small boundary per day. Nothing dramatic, simple, clean. I can't do that. Not tonight. I'm not available for that. No long explanations, no guilt. You're teaching your nervous system that you can say no and survive. Week 3, body control. Train stillness. Sit without fidgeting for 5 minutes. Walk slower. Breathe deeper. When you feel nervous, relax your jaw and slow your exhale. Your body learns calm through repetition, not motivation. Week 4, digital discipline. Stop checking your phone like it's your oxygen. When you're with people, be with people. When you're alone, be alone. If you're constantly stimulated, you'll be constantly reactive. Calm requires space. Week 5, physical foundation. Lift consistently, sleep consistently, eat consistently. You can't build emotional regulation on a fried nervous system. Strength and stability are connected. A man who feels strong in his body finds it easier to stay steady in his mind. Week 6, outcome independence. Put yourself in situations where you might be rejected and practice staying composed. Start a conversation. Offer an invite. Make a move respectfully. If it's a no, you smile, you accept it, and you move on without resentment. This trains true confidence, the ability to risk without collapsing. After 6 weeks, the change won't be mystical. It'll be visible. You'll notice you're less anxious, less needy, less reactive, more decisive, more grounded. And yes, women will notice. But the real win is this. You'll notice you don't need them to notice. That is the moment you become dangerous in the best way. Dangerous to your old patterns. Dangerous to your old insecurities. Dangerous to the version of you that begged for approval. Now let's sharpen the message into something you can carry into any room. You do not need to dominate. You need to be anchored. You do not need to be loud. You need to be clear. You do not need to chase. You need to choose. You do not need to prove you have value. You need to live like you know you do. And living like you know, it doesn't mean arrogance. It means integrity. It means your words match your actions. It means you show up when you say you will. It means you don't talk about discipline. You practice it. It means you don't advertise your strength. You demonstrate it quietly. It means you don't demand respect. You require it through your standards. This is why the quiet man becomes unforgettable. Not because he's silent, because he's solid, because he doesn't leak his identity into every conversation, because he doesn't beg to be understood, because he doesn't chase attention like a starving man, because he isn't trying to be impressive. He's trying to be real, and real is rare. Here's the final distinction that will keep you honest. Calm is not a move. Calm is a byproduct. It's the byproduct of a man who handles his business, who faces discomfort, who keeps promises to himself, who has a life he respects, who doesn't say yes to everything, who doesn't attach his worth to a stranger's reaction, who can be kind without being soft, who can be strong without being cruel, who can be quiet without disappearing. That's the man who walks into a room and gets noticed without trying. Not because he has some secret, because he has a center. So start today, not by performing calm, by building it. Before you speak, Breathe. Before you react, pause. Before you explain, ask yourself if an explanation is necessary. Before you chase, ask yourself if you're choosing or begging. Before you give, ask yourself if it's mutual. Before you attach, ask yourself if you're stable on your own. That's the work. And when you do that work, your presence changes. You'll stop being a man who hopes. You'll become a man who decides. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You'll stop being a man who reacts. You'll become a man who responds. You man who needs to be seen. You'll become a man who cannot be ignored, not because you demanded it, because you earned it. And one day you'll realize something that makes all the difference. The point was never to get women to chase you. The point was to become the kind of man who doesn't chase himself. The kind of man who doesn't abandon his standards to avoid being alone. The kind of man who doesn't trade his dignity for attention. The kind of man who doesn't perform for love. He becomes worthy of love because he lives with discipline, clarity, and self-respect. That's not a trick. That's a return. A return to who you were supposed to be before the world taught you to beg. Walk slower. Speak cleaner. Hold your frame. Respect your time. Protect your peace. Be warm, not needy. Be silent, not absent. Be steady, not numb. And watch what happens when you stop trying to be chosen and start living like a man who already chose himself.